On the morning of June 25, 1950, a line was crossed, not just any line, but the 38th parallel, the arbitrary border dividing Korea into two hostile states. 135,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army surged south, armed with Soviet tanks and artillery. Their goal was simple: to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. The world watched, holding its breath. What followed was 3 years of brutal conflict, a war that would draw in global superpowers and leave millions dead, only to end exactly where it began. This is the story of the Korean War, the forgotten war that shaped the modern world. To understand why this happened, we have to rewind to the end of World War II. After decades of Japanese occupation, Korea was liberated, but not truly free. The victorious Allies, the Soviet Union and the United States, decided to split the peninsula for administrative purposes along the 38th parallel. The Soviets backed a communist government in the north, led by Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter. The Americans supported a pro-Western, authoritarian government in the south, led by Syngman Rhee. Both leaders were fiercely nationalistic and dreamed of a unified Korea under their own ideology. Tensions simmered, and border clashes became common. By 1950, Kim Il-sung, with the reluctant blessing of Joseph Stalin and the promise of support from China's Mao Zedong, decided to force the issue. The initial invasion was a stunning success for the North. The South Korean army, ill-equipped and caught by surprise, collapsed. Within 3 days, the capital, Seoul, had fallen. The North Korean tide seemed unstoppable as it pushed the remaining South Korean and a small number of American forces into a tiny pocket in the southeastern corner of the peninsula, known as the Pusan Perimeter. It looked like the war was all but over, but the United States, fearing the spread of communism, decided to intervene. Under the banner of the United Nations, a coalition of 16 countries, led by the US, was formed to defend South Korea. The command of this UN force was given to a legendary but controversial figure, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, a hero of the Pacific War, devised a brilliant and incredibly risky plan. Instead of reinforcing the Pusan perimeter directly, he would stage a daring amphibious landing hundreds of miles behind enemy lines at the port of Inchon. On September 15, 1950, the Inchon landing went ahead. It was a massive gamble. The tides and terrain were treacherous, but the operation was a spectacular success. The North Korean supply lines were cut, and their army, caught between MacArthur's forces and the breakout from the Pusan perimeter, was shattered. UN forces quickly recaptured Seoul and began to push north. The tide of the war had dramatically turned. Now, a critical decision had to be made. Should the UN forces stop at the 38th parallel, their original mandate, or should they push on and reunify Korea under a non-communist government? President Truman, emboldened by the victory, gave MacArthur the green light. UN troops crossed the 38th parallel and advanced deep into North Korea. They captured the northern capital, Pyongyang, and raced towards the Yalu River, the border with China. MacArthur confidently declared that the troops would be home by Christmas, but he had made a fatal miscalculation. The Chinese government, led by Mao Zedong, had repeatedly warned that it would not tolerate American troops on its border. As UN forces approached the Yalu, Mao made his move. In late October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteers secretly crossed the Yalu River. They launched a massive surprise attack, throwing the overconfident and thinly spread UN forces into a desperate, chaotic retreat. The winter of 1950 was one of the coldest on record, and American and Allied soldiers faced not only a determined enemy but also frostbite and starvation. It was one of the longest retreats in American military history. The war had taken another dramatic and brutal turn. Seoul, which had been liberated just months before, fell once again to the communist forces in January 1951. The war now entered a new bloody phase of stalemate. The front line stabilized roughly around the 38th parallel, the original starting point. For the next 2 years, the fighting devolved into a brutal war of attrition, reminiscent of World War I. Battles were fought not for grand strategic objectives, but for possession of desolate, numbered hills, places like Porkchop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge. Gains were measured in yards, and the cost in human lives was staggering. Meanwhile, a major conflict was brewing off the battlefield. General MacArthur, frustrated by the stalemate, publicly advocated for expanding the war into China. He wanted to blockade China's coast and even use nuclear weapons against Chinese cities. This brought him into direct conflict with President Truman, who feared that such actions could trigger a Third World War with the Soviet Union. The clash between the general and the president reached its breaking point. In April 1951, Truman made the difficult decision to relieve MacArthur of his command, a move that was hugely unpopular at home but essential for maintaining civilian control over the military and preventing a wider war. As the fighting dragged on, peace talks began in the city of Kaesong and later moved to Pan, but these negotiations were just as difficult as the fighting. For 2 long years, the talks stalled, primarily over the issue of prisoners of war. The UN command insisted on voluntary repatriation, meaning that Chinese and North Korean prisoners could choose not to return to their home countries. The communists demanded that all prisoners be sent back, regardless of their wishes. While diplomats argued, soldiers continued to die on the frozen hills. Several factors finally broke the deadlock. The death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in March 1953 removed a major supporter of the war. The new Eisenhower administration in the United States also hinted at the possible use of nuclear weapons if an agreement was not reached. Finally, a compromise on the prisoner of war issue was found. On July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. The fighting finally stopped. A demilitarized zone, or DMZ, was established along the final front line, which snaked across the 38th parallel. So what was the result of 3 years of horrific warfare? Over 3 million people, the vast majority of them Korean civilians, were dead. Entire cities on both sides of the parallel were reduced to rubble. The United States lost over 36,000 soldiers, with the UN coalition suffering thousands more. Chinese and North Korean casualties are estimated to be well over 1 million, and after all that sacrifice, the border was almost exactly where it had been in 1950. No territory was gained, no political victory was won. The war ended in a stalemate. Technically it never even ended. The armistice was just a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. To this day, North and South Korea remain officially at war, separated by the most heavily fortified border on Earth. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, overshadowed by World War II before it and the Vietnam War after it, but its legacy is profound. It was the first major armed conflict of the Cold War, setting the precedent for proxy wars between the US and the Soviet Union. It cemented the division of Korea, creating the isolated nuclear-armed state of North Korea we know today and the prosperous, democratic South Korea. It also had a huge impact on global military policy, leading to a massive increase in US defense spending and the permanent stationing of American troops around the world. The war showed the world the terrifying potential for a regional conflict to escalate into a global catastrophe in the nuclear age. 3 years of fighting, millions dead, a peninsula scarred forever, and a border that did not move. The Korean War stands as a stark and tragic reminder of the human cost of ideological conflict, a war that ended right back where it started, but left the world a very different place. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. The year is 1950. The world is still recovering from the devastation of World War II, and a new colder conflict is taking shape between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It's in this tense global atmosphere that a brutal war erupts on a small peninsula in East Asia, a war that would define the Cold War, reshape international politics, and leave scars that remain to this day. This is the story of the Korean War, often called the Forgotten War. To understand how it started, we need to go back to the end of World War II. For decades, Korea had been under Japanese rule. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Allied powers needed to figure out what to do with the Korean Peninsula. The solution they came up with would have catastrophic consequences. They decided to temporarily divide Korea along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union would oversee the North, and the United States would oversee the South. The plan was to hold elections and reunify the country soon after, but soon never came. The ideological divide between the US and the USSR was just too wide. In the North, the Soviets installed a communist regime led by Kim Il-sung in the South. The Americans backed an anti-communist authoritarian government led by Syngman Rhee. Both leaders were fiercely nationalistic and dreamed of a unified Korea, but under their own system, the temporary dividing line hardened into a heavily armed border. Tensions were sky-high, and skirmishes along the 38th parallel became common. Then, on the rainy morning of June 25, 1950, the world was shocked. Around 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army stormed across the 38th parallel. Equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, they overwhelmed the less prepared South Korean forces. The invasion was a surprise, but Kim Il-sung's ambition to unify Korea by force was not. He had secured the backing of both Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and China's new leader, Mao Zedong. They believed the United States wouldn't intervene. They were wrong. The United States saw the invasion not just as an attack on South Korea, but as a direct challenge by the communist bloc. President Harry S. Truman was determined to prevent the domino effect, the idea that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would soon follow. He decided to act, but not alone. He took the issue to the newly formed United Nations. In a strategic move, the UN Security Council passed a resolution condemning the invasion and calling on member states to help the South. The Soviet Union, who could have vetoed the resolution, was boycotting the council at the time in protest of the UN not recognizing Mao's government in China. It was a critical mistake. Soon, a UN coalition force, with the United States providing the vast majority of troops, was assembled under the command of the famous World War II General Douglas MacArthur. The first American troops arrived in Korea just days after the invasion, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The North Korean advance was relentless. They pushed the South Korean and UN forces all the way down to a small corner in the southeast of the peninsula, a defensive line that became known as the Pusan Perimeter. For weeks, it looked like the North was on the verge of total victory, but General MacArthur had a bold plan. Instead of just reinforcing the Pusan perimeter, he proposed a daring amphibious landing hundreds of miles behind enemy lines at the port of Inchon. It was incredibly risky. Inchon had treacherous tides and was heavily defended. Many thought it was impossible. But on September 15, 1950, the landing went ahead, and it was a stunning success. The UN forces caught the North Koreans completely by surprise, recaptured the southern capital of Seoul within 2 weeks, and cut off the North's supply lines. The North Korean army, trapped between the forces at Inchon and those breaking out from Pusan, quickly collapsed and retreated back across the 38th parallel. The war could have ended there. The original UN mandate was simply to restore the border, but flushed with success, President Truman and General MacArthur decided to push on. Their new goal was to destroy the North Korean army and unify Korea under a non-communist government. In October 1950, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and advanced deep into North Korea. They captured the northern capital, Pyongyang, and pushed all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China. Victory seemed just around the corner. MacArthur even promised the troops would be home by Christmas. But they had ignored repeated stern warnings from China. Mao Zedong would not tolerate a US-allied nation on his border. As UN forces approached the Yalu River, China made its move. In late October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese people as volunteer soldiers secretly crossed the river and launched a massive surprise attack. The UN forces were caught completely off guard and were sent into a desperate freezing retreat. The fighting during the winter of 1950-51 was some of the most brutal of the war, especially for the US Marines at the Chosin Reservoir, who fought their way out of a Chinese encirclement in temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero. The Chinese intervention dramatically changed the war. UN forces were pushed back south, past the 38th parallel once again. Seoul was captured by the Communists for a second time in January 1951. The war had turned into a bloody stalemate. General MacArthur, frustrated, publicly called for expanding the war into China, even suggesting the use of nuclear weapons. This was a direct challenge to President Truman, who feared it would trigger World War III with the Soviet Union. In a controversial decision, Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination in April 1951 for the next 2 years. The fighting devolved into a brutal war of attrition, with battles for hills and ridges that had little strategic value but cost thousands of lives. The front line stabilized roughly around the 38th parallel, the same place the war had started. Peace talks began in July 1951, but they dragged on for 2 long years, stalled by disagreements, primarily over the fate of prisoners of war. Many North Korean and Chinese prisoners did not want to be sent back to communist rule, a position the UN supported but the communists rejected. Finally, after the death of Stalin in 1953 and increasing pressure on all sides, an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. It wasn't a peace treaty. It was a ceasefire that ended the fighting and established a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, near the 38th parallel. That ceasefire is still what separates North and South Korea today. Technically, the Korean War has never ended. The human cost was staggering. An estimated 3 million Koreans, mostly civilians, lost their lives. The United Nations forces suffered over 100,000 dead, including nearly 37,000 Americans. China and North Korea suffered even heavier casualties. The war left the Korean Peninsula devastated, its cities in ruins and its people divided. So what was the legacy of the Korean War? For the world, it established a pattern for the Cold War, proxy wars where the superpowers would fight each other indirectly. It also led to a massive increase in US military spending and the globalization of its containment policy. For Korea, the war cemented the division that continues to define the peninsula. South Korea, with massive US aid, eventually grew into a vibrant democracy and an economic powerhouse. North Korea became one of the most isolated and repressive totalitarian states in the world, obsessed with its military and nuclear ambitions. The Korean War may be forgotten by many, but its consequences are still with us every day. The heavily fortified DMZ remains one of the most dangerous flashpoints on the planet, and for the millions of Korean families separated by the war, the pain of that division is a daily reality. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly political decisions can lead to human tragedy, and how long the echoes of conflict can last. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and subscribe for more historical deep dives. See you in the next one.